The ghost cities of China. The housing crisis is something that most of the developing and the developed world somewhat on an equal standing faces. Now, by all intents and purposes, the global north seems to have just as bad of a problem when it comes to the housing situation as the global south. Of course, the pretenses for both are drastically different. The global north, well, it's because the divide between those of the upper echelon and those of the middle class and the lower middle class is way too big. To the point wherein it is not to their agendas when it comes to policies, when it comes to lobbyists, to even give a damn about trying to make sure that the people of the lower middle class or the middle class even has access to affordable housing. The global south, however, is in a predicament wherein there isn't really a lot of housing being developed because of a lack of budgetary incentives, because of a lack of funding. And then there is an oxymoron to the entire situation, if you will. A country with the second most population on the planet, and yet with entire cities, if you will, the scale of which are beyond comprehension, abandoned. Entire district in cities that can house upwards of 2 million, 5 million, even 7 to 8 million people, only occupied by merely 10 to 20,000 people. Of course, the entire concept of the Chinese ghost cities is not an isolated incident whatsoever. Cities like this, development projects like this, have existed across the globe in various time frames, but in the 21st century, in the year 2024 on to going to 2025, if you still come across ghost cities, it is quite scary, given the fact that there are so many resources that have been expended all for nothing. Before us is a classic example of such a place, and I need not be the one to tell you that development projects like this is definitely not for those that have shallow pockets. Estates, entire estates built for the uber rich of China, only to not be occupied at all. It's not like once someone lived here and then moved away because of a lack of other resources. No one lived here from the get go. They were built and abandoned. No one came through. All of the funds, all of the investments that went into these construction projects, all but a waste. But what exactly happens here? Alright, there are two sides to every equation. And even though narratives of the West might pertain towards a lot of resources lost, China has a different narrative. What might that be, though? Well, of course, according to the West, the most prominent ghost cities of China, or the ghost towns of China, if you will, are quite astonishing, to say the least. We've got an exact rip-off of what Paris was supposed to be, Paris in China. We even have a town which was supposed to resemble New York in China. And then we've got all downright absurd places that were supposed to be a dystopian place with dinosaurs. But the bottom line being, why were there so many weird projects? A country where democracy and individual rights of the people are merely fantasies. It wasn't as if these were supposed to be bringing in a ton of international tourism, but more to the grounds of understanding China's weird and unique take when it comes to pushing real estate as investment grounds, not just for individuals, but for the uber rich, for big scale corporations, as the end all be all when it comes to safekeeping of generational wealth, or even single generation wealth. Now, China believes that there is a very clear cut story behind the many ghost towns filled with mansions, filled with uber luxurious European style architectured villas. And I'm sure that during the time of their construction, they were not meant to become farmlands. Between two very well built, posh looking villas, I'm sure the idea was not to have farmland, But hey, if the land is not being put to use by those who were supposed to make their lush green gardens in them, why wouldn't those that live here make the use of that tillable land to grow some food? China's ghost cities are far more common than one might think. Take the state guest mansions, the development envisioned as the palatial homes for upper crusts of society. Now, the only residents are herders of cattle and occasionally adventure explorers. I'm sure the gist of this article is pretty straightforward. I'm going to link it down below. But the fact of the matter is that architecture that was supposed to be admired by a lot of people, architecture that's supposed to be adored by those that live in them, those that have spent millions putting them together, are now essentially just fancy looking animal shelters. You see, China has been building these cities for a long time now. And according to the Chinese agenda, real estate is the most concrete place to invest. And the biggest developers in China are essentially real estate giants. And the mere scale of China clearly dictates that it should not be to anyone's amaze that, hey, building properties there in the vast spaces that you have access to, the best way to make money, wouldn't you say? Here are quotients that not a lot of us consider though. That according to the Chinese people, it isn't really as bad because there are certain myths that are in place when it comes to these ghost cities, and they want to label these ghost cities as merely cities that are unborn. At least 50 of these towns exist across China. Now, of course, by all intents and purposes, one should understand that they are not barren wastelands. Alright, they are not frontier towns like back in the day when the gold rush was a thing in the United States. Back in the day when explorers and adventurers would go and thrill seek and build tiny outpost towns as bypasses or maybe even transition trails back in the day from going to one coast to the other. These towns are in the 21st century. And they were supposed to be a fail-safe project wherein there is housing already built, already available for the people to grow into and purchase. 65 million homes or so, even more. Built but not occupied. Affordable by no intents and purposes. In the biggest metropolitan cities in China, you will still come across people that are living on the streets. Housing in Hong Kong, people are comfortable with living in literal 4x4 apartments, even smaller in some situations, as opposed to going and occupying places like these because they're just too darn expensive. The cost of living is something that cannot be negated. Creating villas in far off places that were supposed to be branded as a getaway opportunity for the uber rich only makes sense for those people, the uber rich, because they can afford to source all of their requirements and bring them to said place. If you are trying to convince a population that is literally going paycheck to paycheck and pushing them towards dystopian wastelands that are completely abandoned, they won't have access to basic resources that they need to survive. Vast urban landscapes with modern infrastructure, yet a noticeable lack of human activity best defines a lot of these towns. But according to the Mandarin Post and Kai Michael, these are better termed as unborn cities, cities that are yet to realize their entire potential. And it doesn't stop there. China goes as far as to say that there are legitimate examples wherein cities that were once left abandoned have now come onto their own. For example, Kangbashi, once abandoned, considered to be a complete dystopian city, a wasteland with tremendous architecture but no one to live with them. Well, it was designed for 1 million people. It had nearly 20,000 and now has 150,000. Still nowhere near 1 million, but hey, according to China, it's a step in the right direction. Tianducheng, a Paris replica, which was essentially branded at tourists in the Asian region to come down to at a more affordable price point and witness an Eiffel Tower. Well, I should say, witness a metal tower with the same kind of architecture as you would find in Paris, but in the middle of China. It was built as a place of attraction and tremendous economic potential and has 10,000 people living there. That's it. Yujiapu, a financial district, was at first supposed to duplicate Manhattan and everything that Manhattan brings to the forefront. And well, according to China, even though currently its occupation rates are relatively low, it has got a bright future in front of it. You see, narratives will always be spun by governments that are trying to save face. Why so much construction if the objective is not to house those people? Well, because the objectives are completely different. What might those be though? Why do Chinese ghost cities exist? And this is essentially cleared, greenlit by the Mandarin Blueprint, a pro China publication essentially highlighting why. Because of the economic factors, of course. Investment driven real estate is China's major investment vehicle, and there are no two factors about it. A culture of home ownership is driven by limited alternative investment options, and a focus on securing future generations' homes as well as well being may lead Chinese citizens and persuades them to save up all of the money that they built, all of the money that they managed to accumulate and save in their bank accounts and push them towards real estate. People in China are prone to buying a lot of properties with zero intent of ever living in them. Zero intent. They might invest in super huge villas in the middle of nowhere with no intent of ever going there to live there in the first place. Out of a mere thought process that, hey, maybe one day when people go and live there, maybe when the prices go through the roof, I will be able to sell that off. And well, of course, a lack of property tax is another major driver as to why so many development projects happen in China. But those development projects are aimed at basically filling the pockets of the developers and the local governments. You see, government policies is another thing that people need to understand, because a crucial source of income for local governments is revenue from converting rural land to urban land and selling it for development. Statistics show that it can generate up to 40% of local government income. Now, this incentivized rapid construction and a focus on visible economic growth, because hey, the more a place develops, even though no one lives there, according to people, if it's on paper, got more development than it did the year before, it's growing. Now, rapid urbanization is by all means a good thing until it's not. Until it's done in a factory setting wherein only the points that can boost GDPs, that can show the rest of the world that, hey, look, we are developed. Hey, look, we don't have our population living in shoddy built construction. We don't have our population living in poorly built housing. And instead, we've got cities that represent the biggest metropolitans across the globe. We've got cities that are packed with amazing construction, amazing architecture. The dark side of all of that is the fact that those cities have nobody to occupy them. And even though China says that the future of these cities is bright, everyone should take that with a pinch of salt, to say the very least. China is the second largest economy of the planet, way behind the United States, but way ahead of any and all competitors for now. There are a lot of factors that contribute towards China's exceptional economic prowess and tremendous growth. Although it is slowing down, but what one should not negate is the fact that allowing its own people to throw in each and every single penny that they might have towards redevelopment or fresh development projects across the country, with the promise that it might eventually go up in value and create legacy fortunes for their future generations is a hollow dream that China has sold for years. The fact is, it keeps getting a ton of money by selling these hollow dreams. And in a way, a single turnaround point for a single one of these cities, irrespective of why it might be, reinvigorates people into further throwing money down such hopeless development projects. That is just the harsh reality of the equation.